Hello and welcome to another edition of Mailbag. What is Mailbag? Well, Mailbag is a feature of the channel where you guys leave lots of comments on the channel and I attempt to answer those comments, or if I can't answer those comments, I throw it out to you guys who have more knowledge on some of this stuff than I do. So let's get into the first mailbag of this session. Remember, like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Go over to Instagram and follow me there. Go over to Facebook, follow me there. That's where the normal notices are. And consider becoming a Patreon. Next comment or question comes from Classic Arcade and Amusement Park Videos. And this was in response to Gabriel at the last Genesis show, No Investment in Music, a mailbag I did in February 2023. And Classic Arcade writes, also a huge Genesis fan. For over 40 years, there are two groups I've called my favourites and greatest inspiration for me playing synthesizers. And Genesis is one of those two. I attended two shows in Boston, which was supposed to be the very last shows, but they did make up some dates. A security guard told me at the first show, Peter Gabriel was expected to fly in for the last show and play a few numbers with them. Sadly, turned out to be untrue. To answer their question, there seems to have been zero animosity between Phil and Peter. They always stayed friends, and Phil was Peter's best man at his last wedding. Leaving Genesis was 100% Peter's decision. There was some tension between Tony and Peter, who were best friends since childhood. They went to Charterhouse School. That's where the band was formed from. Mike, Tony, Andy Phillips, Peter Gabriel were all students at Charterhouse School. Now, for those of you who don't know, Charterhouse School is a public school in Surrey. And all of them went to that school. That's where Genesis came from. They've been friends since school. Peter presented the award of Prog Rock God to Tony a few years ago, which you can see on YouTube. Phil taking over as lead singer was not intended. That's absolutely right. Phil suggested they carry on as an instrumental band after Peter left. Other people, including John Anderson, who attended Phil's first wedding of Yes, and Phil's wife suggested that Phil consider becoming the singer. Now, actually, just to sort of elaborate on that, for those that don't know, Genesis auditioned lots of singers when Peter Gabriel left the band. I mean, lots of singers. And they were probably about 80 to 90% through. I think it was Trick of the Tail. I'm trying to think back, and somebody will pull me up on that. I think they were doing Trick of the Tail at the time. And they were about 80 or 90% through Trick of the Tail, and Phil had pretty much recorded all the vocals on that so they could keep the recording on track. And the whole idea was they would recruit a singer, and then the singer would then overdub the vocals, and Phil's vocals would be deleted. Now, what they found out was, going through this process of trying to audition a singer, that Phil could sing all the parts better than the audition singers because he understood how Genesis sounded. That was one of the key decision points, which was he'd done all the work. So they kind of decided for that particular album that Phil would do the vocals. And it kind of stuck. Anyway, the big surprise really was how successful Genesis were with a new singer right out of the gate. One of the reasons Peter left the band was it was doing poorly financially. They weren't selling enough albums to survive, and although they played some great shows, the larger venues they played on the final Gabriel tour were half empty. Peter said he left in parts because he didn't want to go down with the Titanic, and nobody expected things to improve with a new singer, but rather likely not do as well. Shows you how wrong you can be, because instead the band really took off on the first release of the new album with Phil. It immediately outsold all the other albums by a huge margin. This was a total surprise to the entire band, who weren't sure they could survive losing Peter. The Phil Collins era of Genesis continued to be solid. Phil wasn't even writing songs until 1980's Duke, and had no intentions of being the singer or going on in a pop direction. He joined Brand X because he liked what he liked best was jazz. What is very clear is Phil had not become the singer of Genesis. Most of us fans, especially those from outside Europe, would never have likely heard of Genesis if it weren't for Phil. They exploded here in the USA in the 80s, and that was directly led to a ton of fans like me discovering the Gabriel era. As for Phil not liking Genesis, I'd say that's mixed. I think he wanted to do some other types of material in the 70s. He did. He got to do all that other outlet. Clearly Genesis were taking time off. By the time in the 80s, the band had adopted other styles, which I think Phil much better appreciated. And in 1993, he had become so huge, he left Genesis to focus on his own material. Their friendship has never been in question. And their strong friendship that continued after he left the band to the reunion tours in 2007 and 21. Phil knows who his true friends are. Now, I can't really add much to that because it's pretty much factually correct. What I will say is, I didn't get switched on to Genesis until the early 80s, I have to be honest. And in my case, it was my German pen pal's brother who was huge into prog rock and rock. In fact, actually got me into quite a lot of prog rock and prog rock bands. Genesis being the one that I sort of immediately fixated on, which was Then There Were Three. I love that album to death. And now a lot of people, including members of the band, don't like that album, but I do. I think it's brilliant. But that's me. I think the opening of track one, side long one, where it goes, it's just got that heavy synth part. It's kind of a sort of synth string part, and then you got the guitar that comes in and goes, and then the drums come in, boom, boom, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And I was hooked from that first probably 30 seconds, track one, side one, absolutely hooked, and I still am today. I listened to Then There Were Three quite a lot still now, as I listen to a number of other Genesis songs. But the other thing I would say is that, there was tension in the band when Peter Gabriel left. I think the band felt that some of his costumes and dressing up and some of his stage antics were a bit too over the top for where they were as a group. I also think it's, you listen to the interviews with the band, you listen to the interviews with Rutherford and Banks, not move away from Phil, but Rutherford and Banks, and they say that, they liked what they did with Peter, but they also liked what they did without Peter. In fact, Tony Banks, was it Duke, I think, or was it, Duke, I think, he said, is actually one of his favourite albums. I could be wrong, but it's one of those. It's one of the albums from the early 80s, and I think it's Duke that he mentioned. I could be wrong, but that he thought was their best work. I love Supper's Ready. I love the early stuff, from the Gabriel era, but I also think that the energy on the latter albums, sort of up to Invisible Touch, I would say. So that sort of 80s. When synths came in and the sound was more crafted, and I think the energy on those albums is just far in excess of the energy that was on the early prog rock. But then I also find that a lot of people are very split and divided over Genesis. You either get those that love the Gabriel era and those that love the Collins era. I love all of the Genesis music, and the fact that they did on the 2007 tour and they did on the 2021 tour, they actually played both the Gabriel era stuff and the Collins era stuff, is a testament to how good that music was.